project, helping Becky and Joseph design what we think is going to be a very interesting prototype that hopefully will see repetition in other parts of the county, the state, whatever. But we're very excited to do something that we think is going to create a really strong sense of community and really serve some needs that just aren't being met today in any way. So anyway, that's all I have, I guess.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it. And we'll hear more from Bob, especially if there are detailed questions about the site plan or zoning implications, those sorts of things. So really excited to have Bob with us. So we're going to jump in again. If you just joined, if you wouldn't mind putting your name in the chat, that'd be wonderful. A quick note that I am recording this session just so that we have that available for folks that cannot attend. So let's jump in. We're going to start with what we refer to as a housing continuum. I'm actually going to turn it over to Becky to walk us through what this looks like, and then we'll keep going.
You bet. Just to kind of orient you all with the world of affordable housing that I sit in, my colleagues and I talk a lot about the housing continuum. The idea is that there's many different housing types that are appropriate for many different types of people. And in the world of affordable housing, we break those housing types up into buckets associated with income levels. That's primarily because of the funding streams that exist to support affordable housing. They rely heavily on the household's income. So on the screen, you'll see a graph or a chart that shows from the left side of the screen, the lowest income brackets, so less than 30% of our area median income. And the columns increase in income as we move to the right. So our area median income is $50,000. That's for a single person. So that's the median income for one person is $50,000 in Chaffee County. And we refer to that as 100% of the AMI or area median income. In addition to putting those percentages in and the income brackets, I've also added data from Colorado Department of Labor around Chaffee County workforce. So this is the population in Chaffee County that's earning a paycheck. So passive income doesn't count, Social Security, retirement income doesn't count. These are actually people going to work on a W-2 and earning a paycheck and filing taxes on that paycheck at the end of the year. And you can see that, thank you, Joseph, he put a big blue box around the different income brackets that are really supported by traditional state and federal funding. So when we apply for funding to the state or the feds to create affordable housing, we're restricted to renting to people only in those incomes. When you start adding up those percentages, right, we have less than 40% of our workforce under that 60% area median income or under $30,000 a year. Joseph just added a wonderful little bar in this graph to show you where $15 an hour lands. And what we know is that $15 an hour creates a household income that doesn't qualify for our state and federal supported housing resources. And so what we're trying to do in our project is look at the next two income brackets and say, how can we support households that are earning up to $50,000? You know, when you hear that, it's a fairly good wage, but also when you look at rental housing in Chaffee County, the cost is going up and up. It appears now that a very common asking price for a 3-bedroom rental in Chaffee County is $2,300 a month. And to get into that house, typically the property managers or landlords require first month's rent, last month's rent, and a deposit of the same amount. So if you do that math in your head, if you're quicker than I am, you'll know that it's going to come up to close to $7,000 or $8,000 to move into a house. And typical Americans, according to a federal study that was released last year, don't have enough money in their savings to handle a $400 emergency, much less a $7,000 move-in expense. So the question that we're really trying to ask is, how can we use money that is not state or federal? How can we use philanthropic and local resources to create housing that will serve more of our workforce? Once you get to outside of that red box, above 50,000, 60,000, and over 100,000, we are able to typically find rents that those households can manage. But the goal of this project is to reach households that fall in the income ranges in the red bucket that you see on the screen before you.
Thanks, Becky. So we're going to move into looking at where we're actually proposing this development. So many of you are probably familiar with Highway 291 as you come in from the north into Salida. Excuse me. The Heart of the Rockies Regional Medical Center Hospital is over here on the right as you're driving down, and then 3rd Street is that intersection that many of us might take a little bit too fast, or maybe on 2 wheels, to go down into Safeway or the courthouse, those sorts of things. So this is the property that is proposed for Jane's Place. And we'll talk a decent amount about Jane Whitmer, but one of the really amazing foundational pieces and the reasons that this is called Jane's Place is that this property is actually owned by Ron Ferris, who is Jane's husband, and was owned by Jane before she passed. And her vision for this property that she was pursuing was something very similar to what we're talking about today. So at a very foundational level, that's part of the reason that this is called Jane's Place, and one of the reasons that we're really excited that this in particular is the property that's being proposed. So many of you on the call knew Jane, and many of you were very close to her and know who she was. Even though I grew up here in Chaffee County, I never had the fortune of meeting Jane. And yet the more folks that I interact with through this project that were close to Jane and have been impacted by her, the more her legacy shines through and is actually impacting me in ways that I didn't think possible. So it's really a beautiful aspect to this project that I'm very thankful for and very, very honored to be a part of. So I want to walk through the proposal here. If you can imagine that you have some pixie dust or some wings on you and you're floating right above Highway 291 and you're looking south. So if you can see my cursor here, along here is 291, and then up as we turn the corner here is 3rd Street. So that's our perspective here as we're looking at this drawing. So we're going to walk through, there's 4 buildings that are proposed to be built on this property, and we'll walk through each one of those. So starting here on the corner, we have a 2-story, what we call multi-use building. The 2nd floor has 2 2-bedroom apartments currently proposed there. And then the 1st floor is a really exciting nonprofit meeting and co-working space that will have a mission-driven coffee shop in there. And that coffee shop will actually be employing folks with special needs in the community to give them some job training and job experience as they work to enter the workforce. So it's a really amazing sort of vibrant way to anchor this corner. And if you can picture this corner right now, as it was shown on the previous screen, it's an asphalt parking lot right now with a bunch of weeds growing. And so if we can imagine transforming this into a gateway experience as you come into Salida, anchoring this with a mission-driven space and development, it's really an exciting proposition. As we move around the property, one term that we've been using a lot for Jane's Place is adaptive housing. And this term adaptive is one that we say and we mean to convey this idea of flexibility. So this building here that I just highlighted on the upper right of the screen is a 1-story adaptive housing building. There are 4 units proposed in here, and each one is technically a 1-bedroom apartment. However, that 1 bedroom is oversized and can sleep between 4 and 8 folks, depending on whether we're talking about single beds or bunk beds. And the sort of partition in the middle of that building is a laundry facility. So if we think about the implications of the design of this building, and a huge shout out to Bob Grether and the way that he has designed not only this building, but the entire site. This building is really the epitome of what we mean when we say adaptable. It is meant to flex to the needs of those who need it, either in the day or the season. And so as a whole, Jane's Place is going to be serving individuals and families in crisis, AmeriCorps volunteers who are here for a year partnering and working with local nonprofits, workforce members that are either joining our workforce here or our seasonal employees, Southwest Conservation Crew members, and others. So we really see that starting with this adaptive unit here, we're going to be meeting the needs of folks that either need a place to stay for one night or a season. As we move around the property, here's a second two-story building. On the first floor are 2 studio apartments. And the second floor is actually a really amazing concept that's being purpose designed for AmeriCorps members. And if those of you who might not be familiar with AmeriCorps, it's a year-long volunteer program where members join a local nonprofit's staff as a full-time staff member, and yet they're volunteers. They're being paid a very, very, very minimal stipend. And it allows them to not only gain work experience and to contribute to the community, but it also allows nonprofits to gain capacity by employing a full-time staff member at far, far, far reduced costs. And so by building a specific unit with the capacity to hold 5 AmeriCorps members, not only will we be housing 5 AmeriCorps volunteers, but we're also going to be building the capacity of local nonprofits because they'll be able to attract more AmeriCorps members to join their ranks. In the corner of this building on the first floor is very intentionally placed a management office. And we can talk more about the management of the property, but this is very thoughtfully placed here to be sort of literal and figurative eyes on site. So the employee that's housed here full-time will be not only charged with managing these particular housing units, but also will be helping the housing authority as they do the rest of their work. We're also talking with various nonprofit partners in the community about how we can co-locate their employees here for specific off hours outside of kind of the 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, to be able to offer services and supports to residents here as needed. And then finally, we have a large 2-story 8-plex or 8 one-bedroom apartments. And we'll talk a little bit about this idea of 4-plexes, but you can kind of get the idea that this building is 2 4-plexes that are really designed to be those 6 to 12-month leases that are serving our workforce, whether it be at the hospital or other area employers. So just a quick reminder as we move through this presentation, if you have questions that occur to you, please feel free to write those down in the chat. And Becky will be monitoring those. If she's able to just respond to it in the chat, she'll do so. Otherwise, we will work through those questions after the presentation. So please don't feel like you have to hold your questions. A quick note about the roles here. Obviously, as I mentioned, I'm with the Community Foundation, and we are not a housing organization. And that's really not our role in the community. Our role in the community is to act as a catalyst and a convener for the common good. And in this situation, that has meant partnering with Bob and Becky to really take kernels of amazing ideas and say, how can we bring these together on a singular site and have them meet the needs of many different stakeholders. In addition, we'll be helping to raise philanthropic dollars for this project, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But we are looking for community members and others to get involved financially to help us make this happen. And then finally, we will be the property owners, and we will be ground leasing this property to the housing authority, who will own and manage the housing. So I'm going to let Becky kind of jump in on the housing authority side for a moment, and then we'll keep going.
I was sitting quietly on mute and forgot to prepare for my part of this presentation. Yeah, the housing authority is currently envisioned as being the owner of the housing and the manager of the overall property. So responsible for tenant selection and lease management, responsible for collecting rent, but I think even more importantly, responsible for maintaining the culture of the environment of this project. So when I say that, what I mean is we want to continue to invite the community in. A lot of the feedback that we received on this design came from nonprofits and employers. I guess nonprofits are also employers. I should say nonprofit and for-profits. And that will help us continue to include them in the programming, any services that might be offered on site or any celebrations that might be offered on site will be very community-based. I will say that the Housing Authority is still in its infancy, and while the board of directors has agreed to continue this conversation and explore how we can bring this to fruition, there is still not a firm commitment for the management. However, if the project continues to unfold as it has been, I feel pretty strongly that we're going to move forward in this light.
I see some great questions coming in over chat, and some of these we'll address as we move through the presentation as it is, and then some of them we'll get to right into the question and answers afterwards. One really exciting piece of this proposal is the actual model itself. So while Jane's Place is a proposal to do this specific development on this specific piece of land, there are two aspects of it that have really sort of exciting implications outside of that property. The first is what I mentioned briefly just now, which is a ground lease model. So those of you who might not be familiar with this model, it's essentially the idea that dirt can be separated from buildings. And so at the very base level, the idea here is that the community foundation will own the dirt, will own the property in perpetuity. We will ground lease, or essentially give over the development rights to the land, to the housing authority, who will build and own and manage the buildings. The housing authority then, from the rents of the project, pays a ground lease back to the foundation. And that ground lease actually goes into a dedicated affordable housing and land acquisition fund that we can leverage for future projects to benefit community. So not only is Jane's Place itself going to be serving a really, really specific need in our community, it's also going to be sort of having a baked in funding mechanism for future projects in Chaffee County. And then I mentioned fourplexes, and we can dive into that a little bit more if folks are interested after the presentation. But the idea here is that fourplexes have wonderful opportunities to be replicable, either on a very small scale, so a single property owned by a private homeowner. Maybe that homeowner wants to live in one of those units. They can actually get a conventional mortgage to pay for that entire structure. And then the housing authority could deed restrict a couple of those units to make sure they're affordable. And that homeowner would then be the manager of that fourplex. Not only would it be building wealth and income for them, but it would also be adding to our affordable housing stock and allowing affordable housing to propagate through the community without it being something that's in the public charge or under the housing authority's management. So to talk a little bit about the money side of this, we're projecting right now that Jane's Place will cost about $3.4 million. And that includes a variety of different costs, but as you can imagine, and as any of you who have done construction recently in Chaffee County know, it is not cheap to build things. However, we are already getting amazing offers from folks in the community to chip in on this construction budget. There are two kind of primary sources that we have for paying for Jane's Place construction. The first primary bucket is debt. And as with any conventional construction project, most carry some sort of debt. And so we're looking for about 65% of our costs to come from debt. And we're looking, and we're talking with a couple of local banks to have a local lender involved in this project. And then the other primary source is, broadly speaking, philanthropy. And there are three main buckets of philanthropy that we're talking about here. The first being more traditional grants that we're seeking For instance, El Pomar Foundation has already given $50,000 to Jane's Place. But El Pomar and other both local and statewide funders, we're seeking grants from them to help construct Jane's Place. A community campaign is underway, just got kicked off a number of weeks ago. We've already raised just over $190,000 of commitments from community members and others that are interested in seeing this project happen. And then the final bucket under the philanthropy side is employer contributions. And again, we can dive into that topic as there's interest, but the idea is that since the housing is flexible enough to serve local workforce needs, employers can contribute to the project and have their employees get priority on waiting lists for specific units. So it's a way to serve and partner with our local employers and help pay for the project itself. Becky has mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, and I'm kind of alluding to it now, but essentially the idea behind Jane's Place is asking the question, how can we decrease our reliance on what is traditionally the main source of funding or subsidy for affordable housing, which are state and federal, often tax credits or other grant programs from the state and federal government. And by decreasing our reliance on those funding sources, we can increase our community control. And by paying for this project from those local sources I just mentioned, we will be able to make sure this housing not only meets the needs the day that it opens of the folks that we've talked about, but also evolves and changes with Salida and with Chaffee County as we pass through the coming decades. If we were to accept federal or state tax credits or grants for this project, we would be held to income and rent limits for at least 15 years, if not 20 or 25 years. And so that's one of those pieces that we're really intentionally trying to make sure we're able to stay flexible by keeping the funding local and philanthropic in nature. This kind of summarizes what I just mentioned. One thing to just call out here, in the middle of this graph down here is the Division of Local Affairs at the state level. Their Division of Housing often helps fund affordable housing projects. And they will pretty readily chip in $15,000 per unit, or even up to $20,000 or $30,000 per unit. And yet still, as I just kind of alluded to, by accepting these dollars, those units can only serve up to 60% AMI or even down to 30% AMI. And if we remember back to the very first slide, 60% AMI, if you earn $14.90 an hour, you could live there. However, as soon as you get a raise to $15 an hour, you're going to get evicted from a unit that's funded by these sources. And so we're really working to try to get rid of those sort of cliffs that disincentivize increasing your wages or make it to where folks that maybe better their own earning potential all of a sudden find themselves without a place to live. And part of the way we're doing that is by partnering with local employers. This is one of our last slides, but wanted to give you a bit of a preview of what we're looking at for a timeline. I've said the word propose a lot tonight. This project is by no means a done deal. We are in sort of an advanced conceptual stage. And because this development is not a use by right of this property, we're pursuing what's called a plan development with the city of Salida. And that involves quite a few different steps, including a public hearing. But part of the reason we invited you all to be here with us this evening is to start this public conversation about this project and sort of offer the opportunity and ask for feedback as we move forward. So if all things go well, we raise the money we need to, we get the approvals we need to, we would love to be starting construction late this year, which is just an incredibly exciting thought, which would put us about 18 months from today from being able to think about being open. So from there, I want to invite a wonderful partner and community member, Mickey Hodge, to just say a few words from her perspective, and then we will kind of open it up for question and answer discussion time.
Hey everyone, I'm Mickey. I just wanted to thank you for joining us this evening. I'm an old friend of Jane's from just only really 20 plus years ago. Her and I both arrived in Salida at the same time. And her and I shared some passionate visions about services for vulnerable families and youth. And we were both kind of starting our own grassroots pieces in the community and merged together and with another woman named Arden Truortha and founded Family Youth Initiatives. I'm sure many of you know Jane in a way that is that exact smile you see on the screen, vibrant, just an amazing soul. Her ultimate commitment was to keep families intact, children out of foster care. She was tireless for 20 years. She served the entire county on her on her work time and her off time. She served on numerous boards and provided, I'm sure, millions in grant writing and different types of fundraising she participated in. I just wanted to give you a little personal hello about Jane and that I'm sure she would be very excited to be here to help with this, but in her honor and her legacy endures, and I'm excited to be part of it. And if you have any questions, I'm here for you. So excited, and thank you to Joseph and Becky and Robert for getting this whole thing rolling. And I'm latching my wagon to see the cause through.
Thank you, Mickey. So with that, I know we kind of presented the project at a very high level. There are obviously many details, some of which you've asked about in the chat. So please continue to use the chat. I know oftentimes if a discussion starts with one question and then we kind of go off following that question, I don't want you to lose your thought, lose your question. So please put it in the chat and we will do our best to get there. Becky, I'm going to kind of turn it over to you to kind of moderate this question answer, and then we can dive in.
You bet. Kevin asked a really great market question. Is there a market gap for another coffee shop? And Joseph, I wonder if you might be willing to talk about the envisioned tenant and the community partner that we're working with in conversation around that coffee shop.
Absolutely. Kevin, great question. Thank you for that. So I will not pretend to speak to a market analysis of the coffee market in Salida. That's not part of what we have done to this date. However, we are forming a partnership with a local nonprofit called Achieve Inc. Achieve is and was started by Jenny Davis, wonderful community member. And she currently runs the Little Engine Eatery, which is a food truck that looks like a old school locomotive in Buena Vista. She employs youth with disabilities and other special needs populations, provides them job training through the running of that food truck. She's been looking for a brick and mortar facility for a while. And so when we started talking about this concept, we knew that we wanted some sort of mission-driven business in the space. And as we talked with Jenny, it really is starting to look like there's a great fit there. So Jenny is looking at starting a coffee shop or coffee shop cafe concept, again, to employ folks that have special needs, to do job training on site and operate as a coffee shop. So I know that a local folks that I think her name is Claire, just reached out today. She runs Compact Coffee, which has run into some issues during the pandemic in Salida, and she offered to do some thought partnership with Jenny in the business plan development. Jenny's also working with former owners of Bongo Billy's and others to get really strong guidance on the business side of this. So it's something that we're doing very thoughtfully and intentionally, but it's that mission-driven aspect of the coffee shop that's really important to the project. Hopefully it answers your question, Kevin.
Thanks, Joseph. The next question came in the form of a comment, and I'll just turn it into a question. The adaptive housing units, the 4, can hold up to 32 people, right? Because we said there's room for 4 bunk beds per unit. So 32 people. And really the question is then, would that be used for up to 32 people who are experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, so we appreciate that question. And we are partnering with Chafee Hospitality, Inc., who operates the men's and women's homeless shelters in a couple of different church facilities. And that has been changing over the past couple of years during the winter. The adaptive facilities are really one of the kernels that got this project started. Actually came from Mr. Grether, who can speak very eloquently as well. So Bob, you can fill in when I miss something. But essentially, the idea is that one or two of those units would be available for this partnership with Chafee Hospitality during the winter. And yet there's this huge other need in our community for seasonal and short-term housing. So if we think about lift operators at Monarch, folks that come and contribute to our local economy, but cannot sign a year-long lease, cannot afford the cost of housing, maybe couch surfing, and they're really looking for a community-oriented place to live. They're also folks that will be able to stay at Jane's Place during the winter. We think about that during the summer, and we think about raft guides. We think about seasonal employees in the food and beverage industry. We also think about Southwest Conservation Corps and the Forest Service, who bring in crews of between 8 and 32 folks to work in our forests and help keep our forests healthy and safe. These are all folks that this adaptive housing unit complex is designed to house.
I'd like to add on to that a little bit too, because I think that the word homeless has a kind of connotation to it. We might see a stereotypical image in our mind, or might see some folks that we know that do live down by the river. But there's a lot of people in our community that are living on other people's couches or in their cars, and they are part of our workforce, or they are our children. There's a lot of young people who leave high school here that are not college bound and end up living in substandard housing or in overcrowded housing because they simply can't afford a place on their own. And we envision those adaptive units as being available to a host of people that might be officially considered homeless by definition, but that we might not feel or see as we likely don't see it in our community simply because they found ways to adapt. So I want to remember to keep that definition really broad, and in particular remember young people who are graduating and have nowhere to launch. And then they end up, staying at home. And as a parent of a young person, I can tell you that's not the best choice. It would be better if they could launch and find their own space. So that kind of addresses the next question in the chat about, understanding that this is not necessarily emergency shelter, but rather temporary workforce housing. One of the really interesting aspects of using this flexible and adaptive space is that we know the majority of people who are choosing to live homeless chronically are not looking for housing in our community. They're content with the way they're living. However, they face a period of time in the winter when they could suffer from exposure to the elements. And it happens to be on the off season from when our river raft guides and other public land management employees are here. So it's a way to meet the needs of the overarching workforce, and when the demand isn't there, still meet a community need that we know exists. So thank you for that question.
Becky, can I add a couple things there?
Bob.
The Chafee County Hospitality, just so you know, they were in the past, they were putting men in the caring and sharing facility there, and in the storefront situation. Currently, First Christian Church is putting the men that need winter shelter, and it's just at night in the basement of a church, and it's usually about 8 to 10 people. Women are being put up in the Methodist Church basement, and that's usually 2 to 4 people. So I think that, what we're looking at is a situation that isn't going to work well permanently. It burns out volunteers in churches and so forth. So the whole idea here was that this particular adaptive unit would allow be designed really specifically for people in this situation, with a full kitchen, bathrooms. And the important thing to know too is that the way it's set up is that there is a person in charge of that unit at night, and basically make sure that nothing happens that's a problem for anybody. So it's a very carefully controlled situation. But again, what we hope to do is do something that's really designed specifically to allow for that. But as Becky said, it's going to be used for many other situations as well. So I think we need to see this as simply a really good solution to a community problem that we have that's very humane and very well controlled.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that additional thoughts. The next question is that housing is always an issue in rural communities, and what communities have done something similar to this. And I'm kind of, do you mind if I field that, Joseph? Because I'm kind of excited about it. There's not a whole lot of communities that have done something like this. Currently in Colorado, the Telluride Foundation is looking at a similar impact investment model. Similar, I say, however different. Also in Telluride, there's a development of dormitory style housing that kind of addresses the same needs. They do shorter leases and seasonal leases. However, we don't have a dormitory designation here. And in listening to the feedback from our employers and other community partners, the employees they're trying to house want a separate door. They want their own space and not necessarily a dormitory. So this is a little bit of a hybrid where we have the dormitory-ish model in the adaptive units, and then we have the independent individual apartments out there. Another comment from Kevin further down in the chat, I think also addresses this. If I get your comment wrong, Kevin, please feel free to jump in if you're still here. But he says, basically, this is kind of like USDA migrant housing program, but instead of targeting migrant agricultural workers, we're targeting our local, I'll say rural resort community workforce. So there is kind of a model, but we're trying not to use that federal money for the reasons we described earlier. Another question from Helen is, who pays the salary of the administrator? And I'll take that kind of from high level, and then we'll go down to the project. The Office of Housing and the Chaffee Housing Authority is currently funded by contributions from the city of Salida, the town of Buena Vista, and Chaffee County proper. Under that umbrella, we would hire a property manager, property programmer is what I would call them, so that we can continue to program the community activities there to manage this specific property. In the financial pro forma that we're working with, the income generated on that rent is sufficient enough to pay for that property manager position, as well as to pay for the ground lease and keep money in reserves for repair and long-term maintenance, etc. And how is the housing authority structured in Chaffee County? So I just described how it was paid for, and the way that it was designed, it was created through an intergovernmental agreement between those same three entities. It is governed by a board of directors. There are 2 appointees from each of those 3 jurisdictions, as well as an alternate for those jurisdictions, and some at-large members. The at-large members, there's 2 at-large members and an at-large alternate. And our hope is that they are kind of a placeholder for the town of Poncha Springs. Whenever Poncha Springs is ready to join, those at-large members could represent that town as well. So they're governed by a board of directors, guided by Colorado statutes under a multi-jurisdictional housing authority statute. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but it gets kind of dull and separate from this project. But it's a great question, and feel free to reach out if you'd like to dive deeper on it. Helen asked another question. In addition to the name Jane's Place, how is Jane going to be recognized in the structures of the project? Joseph, do you want to tackle that for a minute?
Sure. So Helen, love the question. And it is one that we are 100% still wanting ideas and feedback on. There are a couple of elements that we have identified from everything that I hear about Jane and that we've heard from those close to her. Music, dancing, celebration, color, vibrancy, these are all things that were true to her heart. So those are all elements that we look to represent in the site. So I'm going to take us back real briefly, just the site plan, and I can just call out a couple of pieces real quick. So as you can imagine, again, just to orient yourself, here at the bottom of the screen is Highway 291, and then up here around the corner is 3rd Street. So as folks come in off of the highway, there's this sort of central little triangular plaza here, as well as a somewhat wide, it's hard to see with the perspective, but central walkway back between these buildings. And then together with those pieces, there's also this patio entrance to the commercial space and coffee shop here. In this triangle space and in this little sort of causeway here, we're looking to do what I call a musical garden. If you all have seen those outdoor musical instruments, whether they be a xylophone or drums or chimes, those elements are things that we're looking to place throughout this site to bring some vibrancy, some feelings of celebration of music. We're also assessing whether or not we can do a small stage for performances outside. So the idea here is that this would be honestly sort of the antithesis of a quote unquote affordable housing project that is drab and dull and housing only. It would be very much designed and thought to want to foster community and foster connections and relationships with every piece of it. So Bob and Becky, please add to my answer if you feel like I missed things, but those are some of our current thoughts.
I think I've had other thoughts about murals and art and yeah, but it goes back to that community programming. How do we bring in the initiatives in our community that are fostering community building, as well as healthy families and healthy lifestyles? And I think that I didn't have the honor of knowing Jane, but from what I hear from Mickey and others who really called her friends, that those are our values that she wanted to promote as well. So open to other ideas though. So moving on to some other questions. Janice asked about the adaptive housing units and whether or not they would serve children. What I would say in response to that is they're designed to be flexible once again. So we could take one of those housing units that has 4 beds, and if a family that has children need those 4 beds, they can have that entire unit. I think in addition to that, we're working closely with our partners at Family Youth Initiatives and DHS to look at whether we could have some units reserved specifically for families in need or in transition. So ideally, for the health of a child, it's better to have them not in group settings. And I think we would work very hard to have families with children in their own individual units. The other question that Janice asked is about the parking. So it's very limited parking space. And that is a question that I think Bob and Joseph and I are pretty prepared to answer. Do one of the two of you like to field that question?
Sure, well, I'll start with that. Yeah, one of the things that we wanted to do here was minimize the amount of this land that we chewed up for cars. There are studies that have just come out recently, and some studies that we looked into. In fact, we hired a consultant to look at this, because right now the parking we're providing is a bit less than would typically be required by code under the current zoning. It's currently zone C1. But again, we just felt that it was very important to make sure that the amount of land we chewed up for parking was balanced against the use of the land for what we consider more important uses at this point. And these studies do show that the particular demographics that we're kind of addressing in this project typically have lower car ownership than, let's say, a typical market-driven type of situation. The other thing we wanted to point out is that we're going to create a shuttle parking space out on the street. Right now, we put a sidewalk on there, which doesn't exist right now, and with a curb, and this will allow us to have a shuttle space that's dedicated. And we've talked to the Chaffee County Shuttle preliminarily, and they're interested in putting a stop there, which of course then expands the ability of people to get around that way. The other thing we're going to do is behind the corner building, which doesn't show up, but we're actually going to have 10 covered bicycle parking spaces that people can actually lock their bike to, but undercover. And I'm going to point out that really we're about 6 blocks away from Safeway. It's about a 10-minute walk. So those who can walk can certainly get there that way. Bicycling is another option. So what we felt was that as much as possible, we want to make sure that we had enough parking to meet the needs of the commercial space and so forth. But we didn't want to, and as you can see, because it's mixed use, during the day, more than likely, most cars that belong to residents are going to be gone with them to their jobs. And that frees up that parking for the commercial space during the day. And again, at night, the commercial space typically isn't going to need the parking. So it's actually a very good use of that space. But again, we just simply wanted to come up with just enough, but not more than we needed to. I hope that helps.
And that's a wonderful answer, Bob. And I'll just add one anecdotal example would be, if we think about, I've mentioned Southwest Conservation Corps or the Forest Service a couple of times. Those folks are bringing in crews of between 8 and 16 folks at a time. We might have 8 or 16 forest crew members sleeping on this property, and yet they're driving one van. And so we see that both the demographics of the population we're looking at targeting and those partner-driven folks. Sorry, my kids are in the background. Those partners that are bringing in crews, those are kind of a couple of tangible examples of how the parking for this project is really going to be less than what a market-driven apartment complex would be looking at having.
I just want to add one more comment to the parking discussion, because just this week, a report from the state of Colorado was published. It was conducted by Tuttle Architecture, and they found that 50% of the parking in the affordable housing projects that they studied went unused. Now, they did indeed study the projects on the Front Range, so we're a little bit different than that. But I do think that's a pretty profound finding in their study, to say that half of what is required on affordable housing units is not used. And then they translate that into cost. So each of those parking lots, or each of those parking stalls are fairly expensive. You can put a number to it, right? And when you do the math for the whole project. And what they found is that if they were able to collapse all of the unused parking units in their study, they were able to build another 140 housing units. So it's a matter of what we're going to prioritize as a community. Do we want to encourage active lifestyles and kind of green economic living by using public transit? Or do we want to prioritize the automobile use? So I just think that's an interesting study that can help inform this discussion as we move forward. It's a great question though, Janice. Everyone asks it. It's at the center of every development conversation. So I appreciate you bringing it up. It's definitely something we need to wrestle with as a community on how we handle parking in the future.
Becky, I'm just going to do a quick time check and say we might have time for maybe one additional question, and then I want to just respect everyone's time and allow us to exit. I'll make sure to put up our contact information at the end of this, as well as put it in the chat. So if folks have additional questions, they can reach out to us directly.
Great. I'm going to jump over some conceptual questions about how this project came to be, which I would love to engage in conversation later. So please feel free to reach out through those contacts. But I am going to ask this final question was, how do we balance I think probably what they're meaning is how are the tenants vetted? How do we balance between truly homeless people, young volunteers for the nonprofit organizations and raft guides, et cetera? And what I would say is we're developing a tenant selection criteria. That criteria is based on multiple things. One being the input from all the community partners that have been contributing to this discussion. Another criteria would be based on those equity investments that Joseph mentioned earlier regarding different employers that are investing into partnership for this project. Those employees of those employers would get some prioritization on that tenant selection criteria. So it will be a community conversation. Those decisions won't be made in a silo. We're already assembling the feedback that we've heard from our partners and our employers that are interested in investing, and starting to create kind of a point system for applicants so that we can have a very clear and defensible approach to selecting tenants. So I hope that helps a lot.
Well, thank you, Becky, for moderating all the questions.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here. I truly appreciate your time and your interest in the project. I put both Becky and I's emails in the chat, as well as all of our other contact information is up on the screen. If there's any questions or comments or ideas or thoughts at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. This really is meant to be a group effort, a community effort in every sense of the word. So there are a number of ways that you can get involved if you want to support the project, from writing letters of support for our public hearing process, to being ambassadors for the project and spreading the good news about it, to donating financially to the project, and or working with us to find in-kind and other sorts of ways to lower our costs. So thank you all so very much for your time. And I look forward to talking with you at a future date.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.